Hey guys, it's Sagar, and here is my detailed camera comparison between the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Pro. Given a massive price difference between both these phones, I wasn't actually going to make this video. But many of you have been requesting it in the comments, so here it is. Unlike last year, there is a difference between the cameras on both these phones, at least on paper. Whether or not that difference is passed on to the images is to be seen. First of all, iPhone 13 Pro gets a triple camera setup, whereas the iPhone 13 gets a dual camera setup on its back. The primary camera on this iPhone 13 is the same one as the iPhone 12 Pro Max that we saw last year. It gets a 12 megapixel sensor with 1.7 micron pixel, f1.6 aperture, 26mm lens and sensor shift image stabilization. It's funny that last year I paid 1,29,900 rupees for the iPhone 12 Pro Max just for this camera alone. And this year Apple has made it the default camera on the iPhone 13 and even on the iPhone 13 mini. So this year, you can spend as low as 69,900 rupees to get last year's best camera, and thanks to the ISP on the new A15 Bionic chip, you might see even better images than the iPhone 12 Pro Max. Let that sink in for a bit. The ultra-wide camera on iPhone 13 gets a 12 megapixel sensor, f2.4 aperture and a 13mm lens, and this is again the same ultra-wide camera from the iPhone 12 Pro Max. So if you go with the iPhone 13, you're already getting the best cameras from last year, and they are now backed by the ISP on the A15 Bionic chip. iPhone 13 Pro gets a triple camera setup, and all these cameras get an upgrade over last year's Pro iPhones. Primary camera still gets a 12 megapixel sensor, but the actual size of the sensor is now even bigger. It gets f1.5 aperture, 26mm lens and sensor shift stabilization. Ultra-wide camera comes with a 12 megapixel sensor and gets a much wider f1.8 aperture, which lets in 92% more light than before, and it still gets a 13mm lens. This camera now has focusing capabilities, so you can get as close as 2 cm to the subject and still be able to set the focus on it, which results in incredible macro shots. Third and the final camera gets a 12 megapixel sensor, f2.8 aperture which is narrower than before, but the focal length for this lens is now 3 times that of the primary camera. I would rather have a 2.5x optical zoom than lowering the aperture value, but that is the way Apple decided to do it. So although iPhone 13 Pro gets 3 cameras, with the wide lens being able to capture macro shots, it acts like a quad camera setup. Resolution and frame rate options for shooting videos are pretty much same on both. You can shoot 4K videos at 24, 30 and 60 fps, 1080p videos at 30 and 60 fps, and 1080p slow motion videos at 120 and 240 fps. Both can shoot cinematic mode videos in 1080p resolution, but only iPhone 13 Pro gets the option of shooting ProRAW videos. It can also shoot Apple ProRAW images. Both of them get 12 megapixel true depth camera with f2.2 aperture at the front. It can shoot 4K videos at up to 60 fps, cinematic mode videos in 1080p resolution, and 120 fps slow motion videos again in 1080p. With that, let us move on to the image and video samples from both these cameras. But before that, if you are new to this channel, please make sure to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon next to it. That way, you won't miss out on any of the amazing videos coming up on this channel. Starting with the daytime shots. In good bright lighting conditions, you will barely see any difference between the images from both these phones. Although 13 Pro gets a bigger sensor, we are not seeing any more details in its images compared to the ones from iPhone 13, no matter how much we zoom in. The color temperature, white balance, contrast levels, everything looks exactly same and natural in both these images. This goes to show that Apple is putting in a lot of efforts to make the cameras on the iPhone 13 perform as close to the ones from the iPhone 13 Pro as possible, at least in these bright daylight conditions. In overcast or diffuse lighting conditions, bigger sensor on the iPhone 13 Pro captures slightly brighter images and keeps the noise level a bit lower than the iPhone 13. But you will only see this if you zoom in 4 to 5 times. If not, both images still look pretty much the same, especially if you look at them on the screen of your phone. As I said before, colors look exactly the same from both the phones. They are not too saturated, and this time there is a good amount of contrast in these images, so they look natural and balanced. Color is a personal choice, and depending on your preference, you may or may not like the colors coming out of these cameras. But this time, there is something that will make everyone happy. You get something called photographic styles on both the phones. You can choose between standard, rich contrast, vibrant, warm and cool look for your images, and fine-tune these looks even further to make the colors in the images appear exactly how you want them. Unlike filters which are applied on top of your images, these styles are baked into the shot and they can't be undone once you have clicked the image. Both phones get smart HDR4 for taking better HDR shots. These images might look identical at first, but if we take a closer look, iPhone 13 Pro has brought us slightly more details from the shadows of the trees. Both of them have handled the sun and the sky really well. The difference is very subtle and only visible if you are looking for it by comparing these images side by side. But the HDR mode on the iPhone 13 Pro does perform slightly better. HDR mode on this year's iPhone is a bit subtle compared to the previous iPhones, and these images look more natural. The semantic segmentation has also got better, so the camera now has an even better understanding of which parts of the images need to be preserved and which parts need to be brought up. All of this results in better HDR shots. If you're like me and you like to take a lot of close-up shots, you're going to have a wonderful time with both these phones. The subject that you tap on, or the one which is closest to the camera, is in perfect sharp focus and the background gets a very nice bokeh. 13 Pro has a slightly wider aperture and a bigger sensor, so the background in its images is blurred out a bit more. Since both phones have bigger sensors compared to previous iPhones, you might run into a few problems while trying to take close-up shots. The minimum focusing distance is a bit wider on these phones, and if you get too close to the subject, you might see some fringing around its edges. You can move a few inches away from the subject to get rid of both these problems. Now that these phones have bigger sensors, you get very nice natural bokeh to the background. So when I'm closer to the subject, I prefer taking close-up shots rather than switching to the portrait mode on both these phones. Despite of there being a huge price difference between both these phones, it is nice to see cameras on the iPhone 13 go head to head with the ones on the iPhone 13 Pro, at least till now. If you want to get even closer to an object, iPhone 13 Pro gets a macro mode, so you can take incredible images like these. Its wide camera lets you get as close as 2 cm of the subject and still set the focus on it, resulting in such incredible macro shots. These are 12 megapixel macro shots, so you see a ton of details in them. If you are into macro photography, you have to go with the iPhone 13 Pro, as the wide lens on the regular iPhone 13 doesn't get these macro capabilities. With that, let us check out portrait shots from both these phones. iPhones have always been able to take most natural looking portrait shots, and both these phones are no different. Edge detection, colors, skin tones, contrast, everything looks good in these portrait shots. iPhone 13 Pro can take zoomed in portrait shots with the 3x telephoto lens. These portraits look even better because this 77mm focal length is closer to 85mm, which is the most preferred focal length for taking portrait shots on a DSLR camera. iPhone 13 Pro also gets a LiDAR sensor which helps it detect the edges better in indoors and low lighting conditions, making its indoor portrait shots appear slightly better. That being said, looking at these portrait shots side by side, you could barely find any difference between them, at least in these bright lighting conditions. Portrait shots on the iPhone 13 Pro are slightly brighter and have much less noise when you click them indoors or in lower lighting conditions. Thanks to the LiDAR sensor, the edge detection is also much better than the iPhone 13. Since telephoto lens has a smaller sensor and a narrower aperture, zoomed in portrait shots have a lot of noise in them. So I just don't take zoomed in portraits with the iPhone 13 Pro if the light is anything less than ideal. This LiDAR sensor on the iPhone 13 Pro helps while taking portraits of objects as well. And that is the reason it is slightly better at detecting the edges of objects, especially when you are indoors. If I zoom in on this image, you can see that 13 Pro was better at detecting the edges of the bottle and separating it from the background. Again in this one, you can see iPhone 13 not detecting the edges of the lamp, while the iPhone 13 Pro did a much better job with that. Now, like with all the images until now, iPhone 13's images look really good. In fact, they look better than portrait shots from most of the other phones, and I'm sure most people will be really happy with its images. But if you're very serious about smartphone photography and if you take a lot of portrait shots, then you might want to consider getting the iPhone 13 Pro. Both phones get a wide lens, and here is how much more of the scene this lens can capture compared to the primary one. The wide lens will let you capture a completely different perspective of the scene than the primary camera by standing at the same exact spot. These are 12 megapixel images, so there are a lot of details in them, but the sensor and the aperture on the iPhone 13 Pro are slightly better, so its wide shot looks slightly better if you look closer. Everything is sharper in its images, and it also captured less noise in these wide images compared to the regular iPhone 13. Ideally, I would like to have all 3 focal lengths on my phone like on the iPhone 13 Pro. But to an extent, you can make do without the telephoto lens by just zooming in digitally from the primary camera. Now the digitally zoomed in images won't be as sharp or detailed as the ones from the dedicated telephoto camera of the iPhone 13 Pro, but it is just impossible to get wide shots without having a wide lens. Personally, I find myself using wide lens more often, so I'm really glad that second camera on the iPhone 13 Pro gets a wide lens. 13 Pro gets a 3x optical zoom lens on its third camera, and here is an image from it. And here is a 3x digitally zoomed image from the primary camera on the iPhone 13. As you can see, one from the iPhone 13 Pro is much sharper and detailed. Here's another set of images. Digitally zoomed one from the iPhone 13 is not as sharp and it also has a lot of noise, whereas one from the iPhone 13 Pro is much sharper with almost no noise. You will see this in all of the images. Even in indoors or low lighting conditions, this 3x optical zoom lens on the iPhone 13 Pro gives us really good images. On the iPhone 13, you can keep on zooming in digitally until you hit 5x. And here is how those images look against the 5x zoomed in images from the iPhone 13 Pro. Again, since the iPhone 13 Pro is digitally zooming in with the telephoto lens, its 5x zoomed in images are much sharper and detailed. So if you zoom in a lot while taking images, and if you absolutely need the extra reach of the telephoto lens, then you should go with the iPhone 13 Pro. But if you rarely zoom in while clicking images, then you should just go with the iPhone 13. With that, let us move on to the images which I took in indoors and artificially lit areas. We saw in their dedicated camera reviews that both of them can take really good images in these lighting conditions. Both have big sensors, and in these situations when the light is not low enough for the night mode to kick in, the deep fusion mode comes on both of them, which results in sharper, more detailed images with very little noise. This mode has been present since the iPhone 11, but now it works even better and is available on all the cameras on both these phones. So you can take even better indoor images than before with both these phones. As we get to even lower light, the bigger sensor on the iPhone 13 Pro starts doing its job. In images without the night mode, it captures similar looking image as the iPhone 13 but with a much faster shutter speed, while in other cases, it captures slightly brighter looking shots. Now both these phones try and take images without the night mode turned on for as long as they can, and they switch to the night mode only when the light is very low, like in these situations. Thanks to a bigger sensor and wider aperture, iPhone 13 Pro can take same shot as the iPhone 13 in just 1 second, while the regular iPhone 13 took 2 or more seconds to take some of these shots. We also see much less noise in iPhone 13 Pro's images. When you and both the cameras capture light for a longer time, iPhone 13 Pro captures much brighter images with sharper elements and less noise compared to the iPhone 13. Even the wide lens on the iPhone 13 Pro gets wider aperture, so its low light wide shots are a little bit brighter. That being said, ones from the iPhone 13 are not too bad either. If you don't zoom in on these images, both the shots look pretty much the same. So, if you don't take too many images in lower light, or if low light photography is not your top priority, then go with the iPhone 13 and save yourself some money. After all, looking at these images alone, I doubt anyone will be unhappy with these shots. But if a big part of your images are captured in lower light, then you should consider getting the iPhone 13 Pro for that slightly superior low light performance. Now you should know that both these phones suffer from lens flare issues in lower light if you have the light source directly in the frame. I know it can get very annoying at times, but it seems to be slightly better than last year. And if you change the angle of the shot or compose the shot in a slightly different way, you can even get rid of the flare as I did in the iPhone 13 Pro's image. Coming to the selfies, both these phones use the exact same front-facing camera and their images go through same kind of image processing, so the selfies from both these phones look exactly identical. These selfie cameras are in fact the same ones that Apple used on the iPhone 11 and iPhone 12. But with the image processing on the A15 processor, they deliver better looking results. Colors, contrast, skin tone, dynamic range, everything looks really good in these selfies. Both phones are equally good at detecting the edges while taking portrait selfies. Front-facing cameras get the help of True Depth system, so edge detection is near perfect. These phones don't blur out my ears or glasses in these portrait selfies like some of the other phones do. As I said before, both these phones take exactly similar selfies, so if a bulk of your photos are selfies, then go with the iPhone 13 and save yourself some money. Now the cinematic mode videos from the rear camera is not using the LiDAR sensor on the iPhone 13 Pro, so the resulting videos are same from both the phones. Both phones are intelligent enough to be able to switch the focus from one subject to another on their own. But if you feel like they missed the focus, you can just hit the edit button and change the focus to any part of the scene with just one tap. This whole thing takes a lot of computing power, so for now it is only available in 1080p at 30 fps. 4K 60 fps videos look exactly similar from both the phones, and they also get the same kind of stabilization tech. And if anything, I'm sure you might have heard that iPhones are the go-to smartphones for shooting videos. If you just want to get one of these phones with the main purpose of shooting videos, I would say get the iPhone 13 and again save yourself some money. With that, we have seen over 185 image and video samples from both these phones. Well, on paper, the iPhone 13 Pro gets better cameras. The actual difference between the images is not as drastic as the difference between their prices. iPhone 13 Pro does get some extra hardware and software features like a bigger sensor and a wider aperture on the primary camera, a dedicated telephoto camera, macro mode capabilities on the ultra-wide angle lens, and Apple ProRAW image and ProRes video shooting capabilities. If these things matter to you, then by all means go with the iPhone 13 Pro. It gets the best set of cameras on any iPhone yet, and you are just going to love it. But if you are even thinking that if these extra features are for you, then I think you are better off going with the regular iPhone 13. Its dual cameras are also amazing, and as you saw in this video, its images are not too far behind the ones from the iPhone 13 Pro. As for me, I take a ton of images, and I use all the hardware and software features that the iPhone 13 Pro provides very often, so this is going to be my phone of choice until the next iPhones come along. And this iPhone 13 Pro is actually going to be with my wife. She also takes a ton of images, but she knows that she is not going to use the telephoto or the macro lens on the iPhone 13 Pro that often, and she is really happy with the cameras on this iPhone 13. So that is what I feel about the cameras on both these phones. But you saw all the images too, so what do you guys think about them? And if you were trying to decide between getting these two phones based on their cameras, which one would you choose? Let me know in the comments. That is it for this video guys. Please hit the like button if you enjoyed this video and subscribe to the channel for a lot more quality tech videos like this. You can also check out some of the other videos from this channel. This has been Sagar, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Take care.